John did, but this is kind of my little agenda. I'm going to be talking for like 45 minutes. I'm going to go over EPA's wellhead analytical element model, also known as WHAM, simple WHPA or wellhead protection plan. That's not really modeling; it's sort of just a stopgap. Then I'm going to go numerical modeling, and then kind of talk about ModFlow, which is the most used numerical groundwater model, and then kind of discussing a little bit of the nuance with hydraulic conductivity and transmissivity that John kind of mentioned briefly, and then kind of methods to modeling, and why it's not as straightforward as it may seem to be. Intro, talking about groundwater modeling, and where are all the groundwater models and hydrogeologists? This is a kind of a simple one I talk about is, most places only have one groundwater modeler. That's if they do have one. And then not many folks like to train groundwater modelers because they already have one and they don't need to pay for another one. And then many modelers don't like to work for state government because they can make a lot more money groundwater modeling. That's not always the situation, but it seems to be the state already has a guy that's been doing it for 40, 50 years, and it's kind of hard to get, 25, 30-year-olds to learn how to groundwater model, So moving on from that, again, that's just the truth. Modeling philosophy, I gotta say, parsimony is the easiest one. Again, you're gonna say like, why did they do it like this? Why did USGS's model do it like this? Why didn't they do all the things all at once? And the reality is, this will kind of, I don't want to read from the slide, but the easiest one is field data requirements escalate when you strive for maximum realism. The way I'm going to try and describe this over and over again, there's like several ways to visualize it, but in John's scenario where they did a proper aquifer test at that one well from the city of Spokane, and it kind of changed a lot about what was going on. When you're doing a numerical groundwater model like that, you're kind of setting the fence, and then you have one point in the fence, and then the end of the fence, and then everything in between is sort of, the best guess given the model's constraints. And then if you get a point in the middle of the fence, it sometimes throws a wrench in the works, and the model has to figure out how to deal with that. And so I'm going to go over that a little bit more in detail, but basically, the computer codes needed to solve the complex contextual models are difficult to operate. One little new data point could change the model drastically or not at all. And so the way I like to describe it is groundwater modeling is a little bit like a check engine light. When you get that new data point from the city of Spokane well, all of a sudden the model doesn't want to work. And that's because a number of things. It could be the timing belt. It could be, the water pump's broken. It could be you had the wrong boundary condition. It could be you had the wrong hydraulic conductivity for this zone or that zone, or the water level was not correct. There's all sorts of, one symptom could be, 7 different problems. So when you put in that new data point, it's not as simple as, oh, we got real data, we throw it in the model and the model's gonna work. So I'm gonna start from the easiest to get more complex. So we'll go into that stuff later. To model, wellhead capture zones, the EPA basically in the late 90s, early 2000s, basically from the Safe Drinking Water Act, kind of gave a mandate and said, hey, everyone needs to have a wellhead protection area around a public water system well. Sorry, wrong slide. The first 3 techniques are basically just, a circle around a well. The easiest one is arbitrary fixed radius. They just, it's for the simplest, least expensive, put some amount of, radius around a well to make sure, we're not doing anything that's going to, be a detriment to the well. The next one is calculated fixed radius, and it's basically it's a little bit more than just, random circle around the well. It's, they take the pumping rates and the usage of the well, say, okay, what's the actual circle around the well that's actually influencing? So that's one of them. And then the next one is, it takes in a little bit of boundary conditions, and it's a little bit more shaped up gradient in an appropriate way. And so it's not too conservative down gradient, which you could say, okay, we can do stuff down gradient now rather than just having a circle around the well. next one up though, and again, we'll call those like geometric. They like to refer to them like these three methods as geometric because it's just, we're making a shape around the well. Rather, that's quite arbitrary in a sense. There'll be, again, the geometric methods over here. I don't want you guys to read all this 10 font stuff, but basically you have the geometric options and the model options. And in the modeling options, once you get above those, past those fixed radius methods or, calculated radius methods, you have simple analytical models and a numerical model. Basically you have two options. And that starts getting into the math details on what are the benefits between those. So with analytical modeling, most people use WAM, which is developed by the EPA. It stands for the Wellhead Analytical Element Model. EPA's WAM is basically a parsed down version of G-Flow, which is the same model, but basically makes it more user-friendly. Now, analytical models, again, from a mathematical standpoint, use simpler math. I wouldn't say simple math, but it doesn't really use, differential equations in the same way that, a numerical model will use. WAM, in my opinion, its downside, it has pros and cons. Its pros are it's user-friendly. It's a lot easier to teach to people. You can pick it up quite quickly. And the data requirements are far less than a numerical model. Something that, all those models that John was showing, for the most part, those were numerical models. Analytical models, you don't need as much data. You can kind of just draw the map and see what goes on. Now, the downside is, again, you'll have images like this that I show. You have 4 wells here, both using the WAM model. This is, obviously in hidden. And the math behind analytical models is very, it's very hooky. If you can imagine at some point between these 2 wells, if you're using the same person was modeling these, again, I can't promise you that the same 4 people or the same person did all 4 of these. And so their methods and their conceptual site model might differ from person to person. And a conceptual site model is kind of the most important thing. It's like, where is the water coming from? Where is the water going? All those matter quite, it's the most important thing in an analytical model, because if you have one difference, it's going to make it look way different person to person or modeler to modeler using the same program, as you can see in this instance. And again, this might be the truth, but or partially the truth. And if you do the numerical model, there might be some partial where this well might actually take capture zones from here and here. It's less likely, but it could happen. But analytical model doesn't have the complexity to handle that. If it were to do both, from the regional area or this boundary condition over here. The last thing is, again, all this was done. The objective of this is every single well that was a public water system in the country had to have these done. And so a numerical model is expensive. Again, there's not many modelers. Remember, I already told you in the beginning, it's hard to find modelers to do that. And so a lot of state governments didn't have the modelers or the amount of modelers that could, do every single public water system in Idaho, for instance, to do this. And in our instance, it was like 2 people trying to do every single water system in the state of Idaho. And so a lot of it got subcontracted to universities, to consultants. And so in some ways it's good, in some ways it's bad, but in my opinion, it's like have the same group of people with the same kind of quality constraints and procedures do these models, because the varying approaches to the conceptual site models are going to be very different. And so if you have, 3 or 4 different people doing these, hopefully they come up with the same one, but it's bound not to happen. You're bound to get weird things like this. Next up for the analytical model, again, I don't mean to just be bashing the analytical model. At the end, I'm going to try and give you some positives. I'm going to throw in some positives to the AAM. I don't want to be bashing it because it does its job. Like I said, it did, there was a mandate from the Safe Drinking Water Act to get this done, and it does the job as best as it can. However, the problematic thing with the analytical element is it's 2D only, meaning it doesn't account for 3-dimensional artifacts. And in the Rathdrum Prairie, as John pointed out in particular, when you have partially penetrating wells, again, this is an argument. I'm going to try and not spread my opinion on things a lot, but again, all of my points will have counterpoints, but when you have a partially penetrating well, having a 3D model is the most accurate. There's elements of vertical flow that can't really be modeled in 2D unless you do it, unless you model 2D in a weird quasi way. And with that, when you're trying to do these tests that John was talking about, when you're trying to find hydraulic conductivity or transmissivity with a proper aquifer test, you get this big fat equation. And again, I took some conservative example, and in the Rathdrum Prairie, you know, when you have horizontal flow versus vertical flow, usually it's quite different. It's usually faster in the horizontal direction when you're going, you know, horizontally versus vertically. And one of the big data gaps is there's been no robust look at the vertical hydraulic conductivity or the horizontal versus the vertical flow in the Rathdrum Prairie. Mostly because we don't really need it. We haven't needed it up to this point. You know, you put a well in the prairie, you get water. But the downside is getting an accurate, actual, you know, number you can defend in front of a lawyer is quite hard because we don't have any fully penetrating wells. And the problem is this equation here is normally, it's not too much of a problem in the real world. I call it the real, I say the real world because, again, I jokingly say when I interviewed for this job, my predecessor, Gary Stevens, kind of told me about the Rathdrum Prairie and was giving me hydraulic conductivity values. And I jokingly said, I didn't believe him. Like he was telling me, you know, there's like 50,000 feet per day hydraulic. I literally didn't believe it. Before I came here, 1 foot per day hydraulic conductivity values was like fast groundwater. Most of the time when you're in glacial environments, like in the Northeast or Alaska, you know, you're talking decimal feet per day. It's always like 0.05, 0.5 feet per day. 1 foot per day, again, is very fast groundwater in most of the world. And so we started throwing out 5,000, 2,000, 15,000, 20,000, and all just seems crazy. Like at those levels, it is quite different. We're in a different world. And so when you're looking at trying to do an aquifer test, normally you can take this equation, it's just, you know, 1.5 times the thickness times, you know, the difference in horizontal versus vertical flow. And the answer is to have a real well in the Rathdrum. This is just again, it's going to vary, but I'm just going to give you this rule of thumb. If you're 1,400 feet away with an observation well from the Rathdrum Prairie, okay, you're good to go. You're going to get real data from that well that you can use to give a real hydraulic conductivity value. The problem is how many places when you pump the Rathdrum Prairie is going to have an observation well measure any drawdown. You know, John's showing, you know, 30,000 GPM drawing down, you know, 0.7 feet at, you know, a well that's, you know, maybe 400 feet. I don't know the distance, 400-ish, 200 to 400 feet away. So is it gonna, and then you, okay, you might get an obs well at that distance that's gonna show that, you know, but then it's gonna be so close together, the curve that you need to find to actually get a value is gonna be hard to defend. So long story short, to get a fully penetrating well, it's very valuable, but we don't need one here. So getting actual K values to put into a model like this, you know, it's few and far between. And again, the analytical element model ignores all of this. It assumes everything's 2D, 3D doesn't exist. And again, as a general statement, to cover lots of ground, get lots of capture zones, it does the job. Like I said, in the Rathdrum Prairie, my opinion is a 3D numerical model is probably the way to go. Giving some examples to talk about, you know, get some visualizations to all these like math and numbers I'm talking about, to see what we're talking about when we're trying to get a hydraulic conductivity value to put into a model to see what happens in the plumbing. These are some images from Rob Mitchell from Western Washington University. He's got some great educational material. You can see, I'll show that so it doesn't see it. So I'm gonna drag this so you can see the top. Okay. Anyway, so I'm gonna drag this back up, sorry. Yeah. Okay, sorry. I should have made it smaller so I could see the type. Okay, there it is. That helps a lot.
Yeah.
So with pumping rates, again, in different materials, the cones of depression are going to look a lot different. And I just wanted to illustrate some of this here. So if you have the same pumping rate in a sand versus a gravel, the cones of depression are going to look a lot different. For example, in the Rathdrum Prairie, you might see something like this. Again, the Rathdrum Prairie is very flat hydraulic gradient, flatter than most, at least in the center of the prairie on the Idaho side. John obviously showed there's a lot of nuance when you get to the periphery and the margin, it gets a lot different. But here's some weird scenarios where, we have a hydraulic gradient in the center of the prairie that's in the 10,000s, it's 3 zeros and then a digit, which in the most cases it's, in the hundreds or thousands. So we got really flat gradient. And so it's very weird to deal and try and make some of these calculations because a lot of times the gradient helps in deciding, what the transmissivity value is going to be. So you kind of almost get this weird constant with that gradient. And so I'm going to go for the first slide. So, you got sand, gravel, same pumping rate. You're going to have a steep cone versus a shallow cone. You go to the next, you have the same material. You have one higher pumping rate and a lower, or a higher pumping rate and a lower pumping rate. You're going to have a deeper, the depth of the cone is going to be determined by the pumping rate. The radius is how long you're pumping. So all these kind of go into, making a determination of, getting a legit pumping test to get real data. So apart from the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer having its own peculiarities, getting a real pump test, you're like, some of these tests, John was showing, it said it might have been 9,500 feet per day, judging by the USGS model. And then he found the new data and it was, different. It was 12,000 feet per day. You're like, oh, it's only 3,000 feet different, 3,000 foot per day difference. That's enormous. A 3,000 foot per day hydraulic conductivity in any other place in the world is insane. But here we're like, it's just it's like slightly different. But here it doesn't matter as much because it's the same order of magnitude. But on the scale of a normal hydrogeologist, that's insane. So that difference, getting these pump tests dialed and really these data points to put into a model is very important. And it takes a lot of work in itself apart from the model. So as soon as again, striving for that realism escalates the amount of field work quite a bit. So moving on, again, which is why the WAM is good. You don't need that much field work. You kind of get the job done, from the desk, from the office, or a couple phone calls. Some of the guidance for the WAM, again, it takes this is it. This is basically all you need. Now, what's the guidance criteria? You need to know the distance from just distances, drawdowns, residence time. You make some guesses, the flow boundaries. Where's the water coming from? Where's the water not going? Where's their bedrock it's getting hit by? Where's recharge coming from? How many wells are there? The thickness of the aquifer. You make all these guesses. You kind of just go through the literature, and under a week, a couple days, you can get one of these well capture zones done in the WAM. That's not that bad. The reality is, as soon as you get really complicated, you get lots of wells, you get, bedrock islands you got to float around, you got multiple lakes surrounding it that it's coming from, you have problems of scale, which I'll show you on the WAM model. Basically, when a scenario gets complicated, the WAM model is hard to justify. And in my opinion, the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer in Idaho is one of those scenarios where lots of things are going on. There's tons of wells. There's lots of, recharge areas. You got things like this going on, intermeshed. Just lots of weird scenarios. And so you can see kind of some deficiencies in, the WAM models, and you have some weird hooky things going on. You got wells pulling from one source and wells right next to it pulling from another source. And in some areas, you get things like this, where, you have these hooks. Again, this is all just artifacts from the math behind analytical groundwater modeling. Again, the way I like to describe it, again, it's not correct, but it's the easiest way to convey it, is analytical models are more 2 + 2 = 4. And that's the bottom line. You know, it does a very closed form math expression. And if you tell it, if you use a certain scale, it's kind of jailed to its conceptual site model. And so I'll give you an example again. This example is from, you know, 2 different modelers doing the same well. Again, I don't know who they were. Again, I went down to the archives and found the first for an example. And again, technically, both these modelers are correct. They put in everything they thought was right. And again, the way I describe it is this is the Greens Ferry well, south of the Spokane River in Post Falls. This is a source water well for well one, right? And so this first modeler in 2001 figured that the majority of the capture zone was from the sub-basin. And I'll actually show you, I think I have a picture of it here. No, I didn't include it. So yeah, it's basically this this area here. And then the second modeler, you know, 7 years later, decided actually, you know, the capture zone's in this regional zone. Again, this all WAM model, all analytical. And the answer is who's right using this model? I'm sure they could, you know, with the data they were given, without a numerical model done in place, it's hard to say, you know, this person was doing this in bad faith, or this person was doing this one in bad faith, or who was right, who was wrong. Again, this is why you do numerical model. So you actually have the data in place, and you know which one is the more realistic scenario. You know, is this well pulling from the regional flow of the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer? In this scenario, the Spokane River is losing for the most part in the Idaho side, or is it, you know, mostly pulling from this regional sub-contributory basin? The answer is you need a lot more data to actually know the answer to that. The WAN model could, you know, make a guess, but it's going to be based on, you know, there we go. This is the regional. So, you know, does this well pull from the regional flow pattern, or is this well have capture zone, you know, coming from the sub-basin? We need a numerical model for something like that. I give my opinion, but that would just be an opinion on where I think it's coming from, right? I don't have the real data to tell you. Now, again, that just illustrates a problem of scale, right? You know, you take this site, like here's the well, we draw a square box around it. We'll just draw a square this big. Like, okay, yeah, the water's coming from here at this, you know, water level. And the water's coming maybe from here at this water level. And the model's like, oh, it's pumping, and it just likes this water level better based on the math, right? That's the way I'll frame it. And that's kind of this constraint of analytical models. Whereas if you do a numerical model, it, you know, it has the capabilities of saying, okay, at some pumping rate, I might pull from this sub-basin, and another pumping rate, I might pull preferentially, or who knows, maybe there's multiple layers, as John was illustrating, and you know, it's obviously that it comes from the regional, or it's obvious that it comes from the sub-basin, right? We just don't know. And as you said, depending on your conceptual site model, you're gonna have a different answer using an analytic model. Okay, moving on from that. Again, I didn't say analytical models aren't the worst. This is the 2014 analytical model that the tech services group did, and it vastly improved our source water assessments from the analytical model. They actually basically built a large one. So rather than suffering from the problem of having a square box, you know, a site size scale using the analytical model, Scott Miller, the hydrogeologist in tech services, built a large kind of a WAM model. It's much simpler than the USGS model, but it's, you know, it's a lot better at dealing with, you know, is it coming from here or coming from there, right? So it's like, okay, you know, a lot of the driving head, as John was saying, a lot of recharges come in Lake Pend Oreille, and so that regional influence, you know, might play a bigger role in that small basin influence. But again, like I said, it's one of those problems that, in my opinion, you would need a numerical model to get the correct answer with 100% certainty. Again, yeah, this is just showing using an analytical model on a scale, again, at this size. And the difference is, you know, analytical models get some weird artifacts. Like you can see the water table going off into infinity. Analytical models don't have boundary conditions. The math just goes on forever. In numerical models, you can constrain it into a box and say, no, this isn't real. We know this isn't real, but you know, this is just how the model works. Okay. Well, I can, should I take questions in the middle or questions at the end? I don't mind. So I'm gonna move on to numerical modeling after I covered analytical modeling and cover a little bit of questions about analytical modeling or the WAM model, if someone wants to ask a question, because I think it's more appropriate, because I kind of want to leave it behind.
Seth, I have one
Yes.
question from a water purveyor's perspective.
Okay,
Let's just say hypothetically, North Kootenai experienced a contamination event at their well.
right,
And what I'm hearing you say is the analytical models may not be the best tool for us to determine the delineation of the well and the
Mhm.
zone of contribution, and that a numerical model could be significantly more helpful to us.
yes, I agree with that statement.
Okay.
And you'll see, again, I don't, I don't want to talk too, informally, but in this report, there's just like a large paragraph where we're like, we don't take legal we did this, but we don't take legal responsibility of this, because, it's not the most robust method, but it's better than nothing.
Right.
So the idea is it's better than nothing, we have to do it. And like you said, in a complex scenario in the Rathdrum Prairie where there's just very bizarre, bizarrely high K and T values, there's all sorts of, surface water bodies feeding into it. There's a flat gradient. It's hard to just capture all those weird partially penetrating wells. It's hard to capture that in a 2D model that's a flat pancake. And it's very 2 + 2 = 4 scenario. So yeah. Like you said, give the scenario green story. Well, I don't mean to like use it as a punching bag, but it's like, if you're just looking in this cone and this is a contaminated well, I got news for you. The contamination source might be over here.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard to say. And then vice versa. If you're like, this is what you're basing off of, there might be, a failing septic right here or 3. So, and if you're just, you take this as gospel, then I got news for you. There might be a failing septic in this neighborhood or 3, right? Choose to say. Again, like I said, I have inklings on which one's the right one, but yeah, as it stands, I would not say yay or nay in front of the lawyer because I don't have the data.
Right. And I guess that maybe leads to my follow-up question, and I realize we don't have lawyers in the room, and you're not a lawyer, but the potential legal defensibility from the technical aspect, if there was a contamination event, of a hydrogeologist being able to draw from a numerical model versus an analytical model seems quite apparent too from what you're seeing.
Right, it's a lot more defensible when you're doing a numerical model, in my opinion. Again, that's not to say there's lots of academic talk of being able to do analytical models to the extent that's very, very defensible and a lot more complicated. But the answer is, it just hasn't gotten to that point yet, and so. In the current day, numerical models are kind of more robust standard. Again, there's a lot of academics that can get down and do analytical models, very detailed and a lot better than WAM, a lot more detailed than the WAM is. But it takes a lot of time, effort, and honestly, expertise that I don't have with analytical models to make them more defensible than a numerical model in a hypothetical scenario. But yeah, any other topics before we go to numerical modeling and kind of move on? To numerical modeling. Okay, I'll try. Yeah, I told myself I wasn't going to speak too informally, but numerical modeling, for the most part, uses partial differential equations. And like I said, I have a very good friend of mine who's teaches math at college, and he doesn't take himself too seriously. So like say, I'll quote you: partial differential equations are not solvable. My math professor friend. And so what he's trying to say is, if you're ever taken calc or differential equations, basically when you take a differential equations course, you usually study ordinary differential equations first. And like, partial sounds a little more friendly, more safer. But the reality is partial differential equations are a lot harder than ordinary ones, which seems weird just by that wording. But basically nowadays you do approximations, and why that's important is the groundwater flow equation, when you're talking about squares and rectangles, when you're doing a numerical groundwater model, is what you're doing. You're making it the groundwater flow equation according to squares and rectangles, and it solves a partial differential equation in 6 directions. So you have a little square, you got north, south, east, west, up, down, and it does it for every single square all at once and iterates it. So basically the word numerical versus analytical, numerical is just making a numerical approximation. It's throwing, 2 + 2 = 3.9999 for reference. Doesn't equal 4. Whereas that's what the analytical model does. God, that seems worse, right? Well, it seems worse until you get, the double scenario where where's the water coming from? And it's like, it's definitely coming from A. And what about B though? So that's kind of what I'm getting at with that. There is 2 different methods to numerical modeling. John might be able to tell us during the talk a little bit about it in the question and answer at the very end. But there's basically 2 mathematical methods to numerical modeling. There's FDM versus FEM, and one's finite difference method and one's finite element method. And in a way, there are 2 different ones. The most common one's finite difference, which is ModFlow, which is what USGS did with ModFlow, the method they used. And so for all intents and purposes, when I'm talking about numerical modeling, it's going to basically very quickly become just ModFlow, because that's like the most. I don't want to throw in a random number, but I will. 95% of the folks that do numerical modeling use ModFlow or something that uses ModFlow, right? And that goes for like the whole world. Fortunately, places in Europe, they use ModFlow too, because it's just publicly available and USGS did it. And FEM basically allows you to use not, in all kind of practical purposes, it allows you not to use just squares and rectangles. You can do weird shapes. As you probably saw one of John's slides where it had the triangles that were smaller. Those are the weird shapes. That was a finite element method model. Mike, is that correct? Okay. Just want to double check that. So finite, again, ModFlow USG in a way kind of co-opted it. This new version of ModFlow can sort of kind of co-opt the benefits to FEM without having the complexity. Finite difference versus finite element numerical modeling. I think technically the rigor in FEM can go further. You can get more correct answer, but the easier one to get less headaches and take less ibuprofen, FDM sort of is a lot more manageable while still having the benefits of a numerical model. So FDM is ModFlow. ModFlow doesn't use the finite element method, from my understanding. Again, lots of equations going on. Again, this is what the computer is up to. The computer is up to no good. And so there's a lot going on here. And again, the groundwater flow equation here. Again, you take this in 6 directions, but in addition, there's all sorts of other stuff down here in the bottom, like Tice, Cooper, Jacobs. These are all when you're doing well tests. You can kind of back calculate this hydraulic conductivity value using well pump tests, and then plug them into the groundwater flow equation. So you might, in that numerical model, you might do something and it's using this all throughout the squares and rectangles. It tells you that, the water level at, post-fall as well, number 6 is X. And the model says, no, it's this. Well, no, this is the real world. We have this number. You kind of put that number in and then it has to recalculate it and it kind of comes up with a different answer. It's like, oh, okay. I'm allowed to do that. Whereas in an analytical model, it's very weird to kind of just like throw out a new piece of data. Throw a new piece of data, it's like, oh, okay, I feel like you kind of did the sand mandala. You built this like beautiful art thing, and it's not really reversible in some instances. Okay, kind of already covered this. I realized maybe I should put it forward, but modeling and conceptual site models, again, it's just a fancy word for what's going on. What is the plumbing? How do we know what's beneath us? What do we put into the model? What do the squares and rectangles represent? What's in the subsurface? Do we have 300-foot sequence of gravel? Do we have a clay lens of some sort? Is there bedrock shallow? Is there waves in the bedrock? What's going on? And again, a lot of ways to find that out is gravity surveys is one. Talk to John later. He tells you he'd explain it. I won't explain it. But for the most part, putting holes in the ground, getting bore logs, getting reliable bore logs. And as John kind of alluded to, sometimes, the difference between having a consultant put a bore log in and, log that soil compared to, use a driller where it's like, 20 feet of gravel or gray clay or something. It's a lot, it does the job, but sometimes when you're doing a well test, you need to know exactly what's going on. And again, when you're drilling a new well, it's not as important. Say if you're drilling your own residential well, it's not as important to know exactly, is this, plastic clay or is this not plastic clay, right? It doesn't matter. He just wants water. But if the geologist was there, I was like, please tell me whether it was plastic clay or not. But yeah, that's a dream. So conceptual models, vary widely, and putting in, even one thing that's different, one variable changes where water's flowing, right? These are all simple analytical models. Now I just put a bedrock island, and instead of having a straight line going from A to B, now it curves. Now the lines curve. You put a well in there, all of a sudden the lines do all kinds of several things that are very different. Complexities make numerical models, in my opinion, a lot more necessary. Here we go. Sorry, here we go. Yeah, here's another. So, something, for instance, a simple analytical model could handle. Very straightforward. You got two observation wells, a well pumping, and then you measure that cone of depression. What's going on here? Next up, you got three wells with kind of intersecting lobes of our cones of depression. Most, if you're doing an analytical model could handle this, but again, numerical model will do a lot better with translating this to the regional scale. What's going on? Is it going to be catching other flow paths? And as soon as you get multiple wells partially penetrating, there's just so much going on to calculate. Again, like I said, there's just so much going on here that an analytical model is just not going to do the trick. It's just like this. You can pay me enough money trying to do this. It's just no. There's just no way. Where's the groundwater coming from? Especially when there's a river involved, especially if you're in a wet area like east or west side of Washington. You have a meandering stream with a low groundwater table and wells in the eddies or in the oxbow lakes or within the bends. There's a lot going on in that small scale that an analytical model is like, oh yeah, sure, it's coming from the river. Yeah, really? So I'll talk about mod flow now, talking about why numerical models are good. For the most part, mod flow is the standard. And again, it's just a code that USGS developed kind of internally. And again, in the early 80s is when it started. And then kind of got, I'd say official in 1988 was the first official version. There was a version in 1984. For the computer folks, it's written in Fortran. And then the core version, again, this is all kind of prevailing opinion, it's not fact, is the core version is the mod flow 2005, and everything's kind of built off that into the two current most recent versions, which are mod flow USG and mod flow 6. Each version has introduced new features, improvements to the model, to model the hydrogeologic process. One I'd like to kind of highlight, for example, is remember John mentioned that the 2007 model from USGS, when you had all the squares and rectangles, it had one layer. And then in the Washington side had 3 layers. I can tell you, again, I'm not going to read minds, but I can probably tell you why they did that. Okay, why did they just do one layer? Well, in ModFlow 2000, the version they used, if a cell went dry, it couldn't resaturate. And that was just how the computer code was written. And so you can imagine in the margins of the prairie, we had those low groundwater seasonal fluctuations in the center. It was it's like 5 feet, I always say, in the middle of the prairie. And in the margins, it was more, sometimes 20, 30 feet. So if you had a top layer that was a 30-foot sequence and the water table dropped below that 30 feet, you could never resaturate that cell in the model. And as soon as those top ones can't resaturate, then you have a completely unrealistic model because your water's coming in from that layer. I wish I had a visual for that. But yeah, so, in the Rathdrum Prairie, it was very important in the ModFlow 2000 that nothing desaturated because those marginal things were doing a lot of recharge. So I could see, well, the model is going to be unrealistic if we let any of those peripheral cells desaturate, because it's just not going to work. But that was ModFlow 2000, and then 2005 came out, and then there's certain packages that dealt with desaturating and resaturating cells, and so that problem is now solved. But I can tell you why. That's probably one of the main reasons why they did one layer in the Idaho side, because it probably would have been that hard, or just impossible. Again, ModFlow has many what's called GUIs. Some people just use ModFlow, and those are like folks that are really computer savvy. For the most part, you use proprietary software that kind of makes it user-friendly to use. And those vary. There's like groundwater vistas, there's visual ModFlow, there's a few others that people use. But again, they always like co-opt all that free software that came from, or that free coding work that USGS did. Again, and it's modular, so you can make it as simple as possible or as complex. So you basically have all these modular components that simulate different hydrogeologic processes. You can ignore lakes, you can ignore rivers, you can still run a model in a sandbox, or you can run something that's doing this right? And so all kinds of weird things are going to happen, where you have constant head boundaries, you have transient steady state condition versus steady state conditions, you have no flow boundaries. All kinds of weird things that can go on using different packages. You have drains, you have stream flow routing, which means, which is a complicated one. You have unsaturated zone flow, which is important in the West. Again, a lot of times when you're like in, shallow groundwater areas, they don't even use unsaturated flow. And it's just one of those things that basically it delays the process from the water hitting, rain and recharge hitting the ground surface to making it to the water table. And then, places like Arizona, Nevada, and you could argue here, I don't know, did we use unsaturated zone? We didn't. I think it's one of those things. It's like, you could argue for it, but like you said, is that process necessary? Is that, that unsaturated zone flow necessary? And sometimes it's not. It adds complication. The model is hard, makes it harder to run properly and converge. But yeah, so I'll give you this. So this is kind of the genealogy for ModFlow. Like I said, the two most current versions that people are using as a general statement are USG, ModFlow 6, and then for reference, the USGS model used ModFlow 2000, and they published in 2007. And the same way I say it is, why did they use ModFlow 2005? It probably came out while they were doing the thing, and they were probably halfway through. It's kind of like one of those cruise liner ships where the ship was already sailing in a direction like, oh goodness, ModFlow 2005 came out. We have to redo this whole project. It's gonna, it would have been published in 2011 probably. I joke when they say that, but it would probably take another 2 or 3 years to delay the project to actually get the model out appropriately if they were to do it in ModFlow 2005. It's kind of a shame they didn't, because ModFlow 2005 had a lot of things that could deal with unsaturated zone flow, or sorry, desaturating cells and things like that. And then there's also these other ones. These are like transport models. So a lot of this is talking about numerical modeling and analytical modeling. A lot of it's just groundwater flow. Where's the water going? Where's the water coming from? What are the water levels? And that whole time, in 2000, in the 90s and 2000s, you had to use a separate program to do, particle tracking or transport of contaminants. And yeah, there was these separate, or seawater, you get density dependent flow that it couldn't do. So nowadays USG and 6 can do all of that. So if you can just set up a model and then make a base one, like a parent grid, like John was explaining, and then later co-opt it to do and kind of tweak it to make it do transport or particle tracking and things like that, which you could not do in the version, the most recent version, or the most recent USGS model. Again, just to run the point home, this is from groundwater vistas, Jim Rimbaugh. So this is like don't take this data as gospel, but it is a pretty good indication of what's going on, like who's using what. Again, most people are using ModFlow USG. Some people are adopting the new ModFlow 6, and some people are using 2005. As you notice, 3% are using it. So nobody's really using ModFlow 2000, which is what the USGS model was done. How big are these models? Number of nodes and stuff, how many squares and rectangles are there, numbers of stress periods. Most people are just doing one. They're not making it long stress periods. For instance, The USGS model was 180-ish stress periods, so lots of time. USGS one had about 100,000, 80, depends on how you count it, but it's like 70 to 90,000 nodes total. And most people are doing, 100 to 1 million. So it's a lot less resolution. So most people are doing higher resolution models now. What kind of packages are we using? Lake, stream flow routing, unsaturated flow, connected linear networks. These are all just specific advanced packages you can use. Out of 700 models, right? To give you an example. And some of the details on why they did one thing in the USGS model versus not, the numerical model. Again, out of 700 model, only 27 people use lakes. It's how important are lake packages for the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer? I mean, depends on who you ask, but it's pretty important. We have 6 peripheral lakes that recharge in the Idaho portion. Yeah, so it just shows to show like using lake packages historically were quite weird. It was almost a separate model within a model previously. So it'd just be really annoying to use it, and the model would kind of not run. If you tried to use a lake package and too many of them, just the runtime was too long, computers didn't like it. Yeah, so just to run the gamut again is, most people are using ModFlow USG, ModFlow 6. People don't like using the lake packages. Again, it's parsimony. People are trying to make it as simple as possible. But so I just want to give you guys the idea of like doing a numerical model at the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer scale, the Spokane Valley Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer scale is a large task. A lot of times people are doing site-specific, well-specific issues. And so doing a project at this scale takes a lot of field work. There's a lot of headaches on dealing with like, okay, is this one lake breaking the model? Why is it doing it? How much more data do we need to make it not break the model? And what I mean by that is just converging. The math has to converge, and the computer has to like it when it's like, there's a margin of error it gets when it does all these calculations. And it, like I said, it's like a job on mechanic. Like, okay, a car sounds like this, or it's revving weird. It could be 6 different problems. And lots of field work. You might need lots of field work to figure that out, to parse that out, or you might have typed in a wrong column somewhere. And you got to figure out where you typed it in wrong. Did you put in the wrong hydraulic conductivity? Did you add too many decimals to the hydraulic gradient? This is all kinds of insane things to think about. Okay, so properties of the Spokane Valley Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer. Again, I already kind of ran through this, so I'm going to skip through this quick. But the hydraulic conductivity is, my favorite. I think I have the. Oh, I didn't have that. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up here, but I didn't make it in. Basically, one of my favorite quotes from the USGS model is, the hydraulic conductivity is some of the highest values measured in the natural environment, which is fancy scientific person saying we have some of the fastest in the world. Nobody really sees this. Again, you have 60,000 GPM wells. As a general statement, like that's crazy. You have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 GPM wells as just a rule. If you put a well in, it's quite weird. Dealing with that, again, one of the big things is horizontal hydraulic conductivity versus vertical. Again, that's something that we need to kind of parse. We don't have fully penetrating wells, and that can change, what goes on. Lots of variations in nuances. Again, everyone's like, as John and I were discussing earlier, it's like, we have to think it's high, but geology isn't a perfect sorter of materials, and things like eddies and contributory basins are going to have more fines or alternating fines with coarse sediments. And the answer is we haven't really had the impetus to find out where all this is. Where are all these clay layers? Is there laterally extensive sand units like we found in John's work? Are there not? Where do all these things taper out? And so the answer is, the more you get in the data, the more you get these projects in, the more you kind of refine the model. And you come in, you get better hydraulic conductivity values. You get a lot more ability to be able to parse out situations like this, where you have multiple wells in weird scenarios, rather than just these pluggy analytical model catchment zones. Okay, So I think that I'm at the end of time here, so I'm gonna just, I think I'll leave it, I'll just go to questions here. I don't want to go over that slide, 'cause it's gonna take too long, but I'll just end it here so I don't go too long. We can take any questions about numerical models, and I'll kind of leave this up so we can, if you guys want to read instead of ask any questions. Okay. Yeah.
I just want to go back to the fact that DEQ has generated hundreds of source water assessment reports based on the WAM model.
Yeah.
And given the discrepancies that you've mentioned between the analytical and the numerical modeling, how does DEQ, how are they going to address those previous delineations for water systems? Because it appears that there could be quite a discrepancy.
Right. And this is partly why I am here. I'm sort of, in a way, I don't want to say I'm advocating, but I'm very much in support of this effort, because within the Rathdrum Prairie system in particular, I think there's a need for a numerical model to address for the water purveyors. For instance, there's already an impetus that in the Treasure Valley, they have already done this in Boise to address this. So, in the Snake River Plain in southern Idaho, the Snake River Plain aquifer, you find a, ag well or public water system well in the middle of the Snake River Plain aquifer with no other, complexities around. The WAM model is just fine. You're in Nampa, Meridian, Boise, and there's all sorts of wells pulling each other from this flat sheet of water, as I like to say. When you're in basalt aquifers, a lot of times just flat sheets of water at different depths. They did the same thing. They had to do a numerical groundwater model for the Treasure Valley. And so they'd already basically, as soon as there's an impetus or a lot of population density, lots of wells going on, it seems people are kind of leaning toward getting a numerical model done.
And it seems to me that given the fact that the Spokane Valley or the Spokane Valley aquifer and the Bradford Prairie aquifer or sole source aquifer, it would be as important to redo those delineations in this area as well.
Right. I agree.
So just kind of a follow on to that. I don't do the WAM model very much just because clients generally want us to do something more involved.
Yeah.
That model is only thinking one well at a time, right? It's not.
Yes.
It's not accounting for all the other pumping going on.
Right.
That's one of the key strengths of a numerical model. Is you simulate how all the pumping is affecting the groundwater flow pattern. You can do that month by month, seasonally. You could even do it daily, but nobody does it. That's too hard to do. But that's where the numerical model's real power is because then everybody, and this was what the SHAB did, why they were formed, was they did all their wellhead protection delineations for all their members all at once, so that they were all accounting for each other's pumping in the same numerical model framework. So there was essentially a set of consistent, not only assumptions, but model conditions behind those capture zones that were being produced. That's the real power of having that numerical tool.
Right. Yeah. And that I'm glad John brought that up. Yeah. With the WAM model, it solves one element. So it does not do multiple pumping wells at the same time. You click it, it solves it for the one well, and basically with not much interaction with any of the other wells pumping. And so that's partly why Scott did that larger scale one. He realized, like, we can't just keep doing, 40-acre scale WAM models in the Prairie, at least. So he went and kudos to him to do that. But yeah, like I said, the WAM model in Twin Falls, 15 miles outside of Twin Falls in the middle of nowhere, it's gonna be fine. But as soon as you have lots of wells interacting, especially the Treasure Valley in particular, where there's, there might be a water quantity or intersecting,